Picture St. Petersburg during the luminous white nights of summer, when darkness never fully arrives and the city exists in a perpetual state of twilight. In this ethereal atmosphere, Fyodor Dostoevsky set one of his most psychologically intimate works, White Nights. The unnamed narrator wanders through the canals and bridges, and he is a lonely dreamer whose internal monologue reveals more about human longing than volumes of external action ever could. Today, visitors to St. Petersburg can find Dostoevsky's bronze statue near the Vladimir Church, the writer captured mid-stride with his characteristic intense gaze. The real monument to his genius isn't bronze. It's the way he taught literature to turn inward, to recognize that the most compelling dramas unfold not in drawing rooms or on battlefields, but within the corridors of human consciousness itself. In White Nights, the protagonist's brief encounter with a young woman becomes the catalyst for an entire universe of psychological exploration. Through 4 nights of conservation and connection, Dostoevsky reveals how memory, fantasy, and hope interweave to create the texture of inner life. The story's power lies not in what happens, remarkably little by conventional standards, but in how beautifully it captures the psychology of romantic yearning and the human need for connection. This is psychological fiction at its essence, the understanding that our inner lives are not merely preparation for action, but are themselves the most profound theatre of human experience. From these misty St. Petersburg streets to the drawing rooms of Victorian England, literature has continually discovered new ways to map the human psyche. I'm Madeline Rose Jones, and I study history, literature, and culture. Welcome to Snowy Fictions. Psychological fiction represents one of literature's most profound innovations, the turn inward towards the human mind itself as the primary landscape of narrative exploration. Unlike traditional fiction that focuses primarily on external action and plot-driven events, psychological fiction delves deep into the inner workings of consciousness, mapping the terrain of thoughts, emotions, memories, and the complex interplay between perception and reality. At its core, psychological fiction is concerned with character interiority, the rich, often contradictory world that exists within the human psyche. This literary approach recognizes that the most significant battles often fought not on external battlefields, but within the chambers of the mind, where desire conflicts with duty, where past trauma shapes present perception, and where the self struggles to understand its own nature. It's important to distinguish psychological fiction from fiction that simply benefits from psychological analysis. While virtually any work of literature can be examined through a psychological lens, revealing unconscious motivations, symbolic meanings, or cultural attitudes and anxieties, psychological fiction is intentionally constructed to foreground psychological processes as its primary concern. The difference lies in authorial intent and narrative focus, as psychological fiction deliberately makes the workings of consciousness its central subject matter, rather than using psychology as one analytical tool among many to understand a work primarily concerned with other themes. The roots of psychological fiction can be traced back to the literary giants of the Victorian era and Tsarist Russia, who began to recognize that human behavior springs from complex psychological motivations that demand careful examination. We start with Dostoevsky, who stands as perhaps the most influential pioneer of psychological fiction. In Crime and Punishment, he doesn't merely tell us that Raskolnikov commits murder. Instead, he takes us on a harrowing journey through the character's tortured reasoning, his philosophical justifications, and the psychological aftermath of his crime. The novel becomes a study in guilt, conscience, and the human capacity for self-deception. What makes Dostoevsky's approach revolutionary is his willingness to inhabit his characters' minds completely, presenting their thoughts not as neat, logical progressions, but as the chaotic, contradictory streams that they actually are. In Notes from the Underground, the unnamed narrator's rambling confessions reveal the psychology of resentment and alienation with unprecedented honesty. Dostoevsky understood that psychological truth often emerges not through direct statement, through the gaps, contradictions, and unintended revelations in how people think and speak about themselves. The Russian master's exploration of trauma is particularly noteworthy. His characters carry deep psychological wounds, whether from poverty, crime, or spiritual crisis, and these traumas shape their perceptions and actions in ways they themselves don't fully understand. This psychological realism would profoundly influence how literature depicts the lasting effects of traumatic experience. For now, we also look at George Eliot, the psychology of moral development. George Eliot brought a different but equally profound psychological insight to her work. In Middlemarch, she creates what she called a study of provincial life, but it's really a study of how consciousness develops and changes over time. Her protagonist, Dorothea Brooke, begins with idealistic notions that are gradually refined through experience and self-reflection. Eliot's genius lies in her ability to show the slow, often difficult process of psychological growth. She understood that people don't dramatically change overnight, but through small insights and experiences over time. Her characters' inner lives are presented with scientific precision. She was deeply influenced by contemporary developments in psychology and philosophy, yet they never lose their emotional authenticity. In Silas Marner, Eliot explores how trauma can shut down emotional life and how love and community can gradually restore psychological wholeness. The weaver's transformation from miserly isolation to loving fatherhood is charted with careful attention to the psychological processes involved in healing and growth. What distinguishes psychological fiction from earlier literary forms is its commitment to representing the full complexity of inner experience. Traditional novels might tell us that a character is conflicted. Psychological fiction, meanwhile, shows us the conflict as it plays out in real time with consciousness itself. This approach requires sophisticated narrative techniques. Authors must find ways to represent thought processes that are often nonlinear, associative, and deeply personal. They must capture not just what the characters think, but how they think, the rhythm and texture of consciousness itself. The representation of memory becomes crucial in this context. Psychological fiction recognizes that the past is never really truly past us. It lives on in the present moment, shaping perception and behavior in ways that are often unconscious. Characters in psychological fiction are haunted by their histories, not just as external facts, but as psychological realities that continue to influence their inner lives. Interestingly, psychological fiction has had a significant impact on thriller and mystery literature. The traditional mystery asks, "Who done it?" while psychological fiction asks, "Why?" And what does this reveal about the human condition? Writers like Patricia Highsmith in The Talented Mr. Ripley created psychological thrillers that are less concerned with the mechanics of crime than with the twisted psychology that makes criminal behavior possible. The unreliable narrator, a staple of psychological fiction, has become a powerful tool in mystery writing. When we can't trust the consciousness through which we're experiencing the story, every revelation becomes questionable, every assumption potentially false. This technique transforms the reader from passive consumer to active detective, forced to piece together psychological truth from incomplete and potentially deceptive information. Contemporary psychological thrillers like Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl demonstrate how psychological fiction's insights into self-deception, manipulation, and the performative aspects of identity can create suspense that goes beyond mere plot twists to touch on fundamental questions about the nature of truth and human relationships. One of psychological fiction's most important contributions has been its sophisticated treatment of trauma and its lasting effects. Rather than treating traumatic experiences as simple plot points, psychological fiction explores how trauma becomes embedded in consciousness, affecting perception, memory, and behavior in complex ways. Dostoevsky's characters often suffer from what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress, although he did not have that clinical vocabulary. Their psychological symptoms, hypervigilance, disassociation, intrusive memories, are rendered with remarkable accuracy. The underground man's social anxiety and self-destructive behavior, Raskolnikov's fevered state after the murder, these aren't just dramatic devices, but careful observations of how the mind responds to overwhelming experiences. This attention to trauma's psychological reality has made psychological fiction an important precursor to contemporary trauma theory and narrative therapy. By showing how traumatic experience can be transformed through telling and retelling, through the construction of meaning and the development of understanding, psychological fiction points towards literature's healing power. Virginia Woolf represents perhaps the most significant evolution in psychological fiction's development. Building on the foundations laid by Dostoevsky and Eliot, Woolf revolutionized how literature could represent consciousness itself through her innovations in stream of consciousness technique. In Mrs. Dalloway, Woolf captures a single day in London, but through her psychological approach, that day becomes a window into multiple consciousnesses, each carrying its own history, traumas, and desires. The novel moves between different characters' inner worlds, showing how individual psychological experiences intersect, even when the characters themselves are unaware of these connections. Woolf's treatment of mental illness in characters like Warren Smith combines clinical accuracy with profound empathy. Warren's struggles with mental illness informed her writing, giving her insights into the fragility and resilience of consciousness that few authors have matched to this day. Into the Lighthouse, she demonstrates how memory and perception shape reality, structuring the novel to mirror psychological time rather than chronological time. Woolf's impact extends beyond technique to philosophy, understanding that consciousness itself isn't separate from the world, but deeply interconnected with it. Her characters' psychological states are influenced by everything from weather to social structures, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of how individual psychology relates to larger cultural contexts. Psychological fiction represents literature's recognition that the human mind itself is the most fascinating and complex landscape for artistic exploration. From Dostoevsky's tormented criminals to Woolf's stream of consciousness innovations, this genre has consistently pushed the boundaries of what literature can reveal about human nature. The techniques developed by these masters have become fundamental tools of modern storytelling across all media. Their influence extends far beyond literature into psychology, film, and our general understanding of human behavior. By taking seriously the inner lives of characters, psychological fiction has helped create more nuanced and empathetic ways of understanding what it means to be human. In a world where external events often dominate our attention, psychological fiction reminds us of the most important dramas, whether it is the struggle for identity, meaning, love, or morality, played out in the theatre of our mind. Its legacy continues to evolve, finding new expressions in contemporary literature while maintaining its commitment to the fundamental insight understanding human psychology is essential to understanding human experience itself. If you are interested in exploring these techniques in your own writing, I offer creative writing classes where we dive deep into character development and psychological realism. You can also find more literary analysis and writing insights on my blog, and I'd love to have you join my mailing list for regular updates on literature, culture, and creative writing. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon for our next exploration into the fascinating worlds of history, literature, and culture.